Hey there, I'm Sharon Welch, and welcome to A Brave Journey, the podcast to help you throw out those legacy belief and identity stories that you've been lugging around on autopilot for decades so you can jump back in the driver's seat of your aliveness again. When you change your mind, you change your life. Are you ready? Let's get into it. It'll be fun. I have recently returned from a number of months of travel overseas back to the US to begin that reintegration process into my quote normal life. And it's striking how what we assume is normal forever and ever, amen, is really just something that we're used to. Coming back to old ways of doing things and places where I live and things that I eat, even people that I interact with all feels so foreign to me when just 4 or 5 months ago was my norm. And so I've been reflecting a lot about this trip that I took, this journey that I was on literally throughout the winter to really reflect on some of the things that I've learned or some of the things that I've been able to put into practice that I often talk about here, and some of the challenges that I faced as well, and some of the ways that I was able to grow, some of the ways that I was forced into looking at things from a different perspective. And I think sometimes it can be difficult to take a different perspective when we are in our comfort zone. It's so easy to be on autopilot. And as we've talked about before, sometimes autopilot is self preservation. Autopilot is what allows us to process lots of boring day to day input without having to think about every single thing. But there are pitfalls to that. So I'm thinking back on this trip that I just came back from as I'm reintegrating back into my life in the United States. And that falling back into patterns that we've talked about before, a lot of times it can be so easy when you've pushed yourself out of your comfort zone. And if you haven't taken the time to rest and integrate and allow that to become your natural way of being and allow that to become comfortable, it's just easier to go back to what you know, go back into those patterns. And so that's one of the areas that I'm finding will be probably challenging for me. There were some ways of being that I developed while traveling that I would like to maintain as I return here to the US for the next several months while I'm here. The way that I was out in nature more, the things that I eat, how I eat, the way that I experience the world, slowing down, paying attention, recognizing the little miracles. These are all things that I discovered in myself while I was traveling that I would like to maintain. And I've noticed as I've moved about here back in the US, getting back into my typical life. I don't want to call it normal because I think one of the things I've learned is that normal is a very limiting term and it's a little misleading. A lot of times, normal just means what we're used to. Think about that in things that you come across every single day, where if something looks different from how you expect to see it or from how you've experienced in the past, it's not normal. So normal is not only extremely subjective, but it's something that's fluid and flexible and it changes with your experience. So I've come back to the US to the life I've typically led in the past and am finding that these things that I want to preserve from my experience overseas, it is challenging because those things that I got used to, those things that I discovered about myself, I was in a place where there was the space to discover those. There was the space to have those be a part of my life. And being back in a completely different physical world, emotional world, ideological world here in the US, they don't fit quite as easily. And so I found myself, over the last several days coming up against challenges to continuing those things that I want to keep doing. And I think that's something that happens to us as well on our inner journey. Things that, maybe we experience an aha moment or we learn something new about ourselves or we take a chance and do explore and build out some new aspect of ourself that feels more authentic. And then when we try to take off the training wheels and really live that truth out in the typical world that we inhabit at this moment, it's hard. And so, or it can be hard. And it feels like maybe we're wrong. Maybe we were mistaken. Maybe there is no room for that part of ourselves in the world. And I think that's something that we all struggle with. And I think this trip, in a very physical and visceral way, was just a reinforcement that that's okay. That's going to happen. To be able to see that literally manifest as I go from a foreign or unfamiliar world back to my familiar world is so similar to the journey of rediscovering myself inside and then trying to express that on the outside. So it's so interesting how it's almost like it's like an illustrative tale of how all that works. Another thing that I have observed since being back is really about how stress, anxiety, and uncertainty physically manifests itself in my body. Over the period of my travels, I had an opportunity in both direct and indirect ways to really be in my body and pay attention to things like my breath and how I hold myself. I took, I went to yoga, I did some breath work, did some meditation. I had time to myself to really just be with my thoughts in nature, in the quiet, to really try to find that stillness and really embody myself to be connected to my body so that I could better understand how to move around in the world. And a couple of things that I recognized early on in my trip were things that I'd like to continue to be mindful of, such as when I am under stress, I tend to hold my breath. Now, this is probably a very common reaction to stress. You hear all the time about how you come back to the breath. It's all about your breath. Keep your breath. And I had that message so much during my travels. And it was so eye opening to realize that I actually physically, literally hold my breath when I'm under stress to the point of like, until I really snap out of it, this little mini trance of holding my breath, I get out of breath. I have to then gulp air to get back on an even keel. And this became so apparent to me throughout my travels early on because I found that as I became more mindful, I would catch myself doing it. And then as I continued through my trip, I found that I did it less and less, that instead I was starting to breathe into these things. I would take some breaths, I would pause for a moment. And for me, I really think it was having that luxury of time and spaciousness to really be with myself that I was even able to recognize that. And as I've come back into my life in the US, driving a car, which I haven't done in a number of months, going to Target, or a large grocery store, I found that I was holding my breath again. And I recognized it right away because I had taken the time to embody myself and notice it and feel what it felt like to not do that. So it was much easier to catch it when I came back into what is now a little bit of an unfamiliar environment. As I'm trying to navigate that, my stress levels went back up. And because it was so much new input back in this world that I'm reacquainting myself with, I had a lot more things on autopilot than I have had in a little while just because I couldn't manage everything, right? So the holding my breath was definitely something that I paid attention to. And so that's something that I want to make sure to continue to focus on and think about when you are in situations of discomfort or stress or anxiety. Do you hold your breath? Do you deprive yourself of the breath to get through that situation. And if you do, it's probably a good time to remember some of those quick tools in your pack that can help you get back to your breath. The other thing that was a kind of a mind blowing realization was I think I've talked about before how for a number of years I held on to quite a bit of excess weight. And what I learned as I reflected back on that, looking back on that time in my life, the connection that I made is that excess weight for me was a force field. It was a way for me to insulate myself from the discomfort and hurt of a world that I didn't feel safe in, that I didn't feel comfortable in. I didn't feel good about myself. I didn't feel good about my worth. And so for me, having a force field, having sort of like a protective barrier was a physical manifestation for me by carrying that excess weight. But one thing that I had always prided myself on, and I always kind of explained it away to, oh, it just must be my genes or whatever. I have always had amazing abs. Like even under all the excess weight, rock hard abs until this winter. And what I realized while doing some of these other more embodying mindful exercises and work, the reason I have such rock hard abs is because I have gone through most of my adult life with my gut clenched and ready for a gut punch. Let that sink in. It was only as I became good at embodying myself and learning to truly systematically relax my body that I even felt or noticed my abs release. I literally have been doing nonstop isometric exercise with my abs most of my adult life, preparing myself for a gut punch. It was really emotional for me to recognize that. And while, yes, this sounds like an example of taking something that most of my life I saw as a huge positive and breaking it down and turning it into a negative, it's not that at all. To recognize that I was on autopilot for so long and I had so many things inside me that were out of alignment and inauthentic to who I really was, my body sprung into action to protect me. And now, as I'm doing this work and as I am peeling back those layers, peeling back those stories to get down to the core of who I really am, now I don't need that. And so I was able to recognize it in my body so that I could release it and that I could feel it being released. And that's huge. That was a huge turning point for me to realize that my body had been protecting me for so long because I wasn't mentally and emotionally to a point yet where I could do it myself. And so to get the signal that now I'm ready to do it myself, all of a sudden, for just a minute, my mind came off of autopilot and I felt that clench. And then I also felt myself release it. Really, really powerful. Something else that I really experienced while traveling was two things. One, experiencing periods of being blue, being out of sorts, being sad, maybe a little depressed. And then the other, the guilt or anxiety over doing nothing. I think when you travel or do something that others either dream about but haven't been able to do yet, or have done and had an amazing experience and live in that memory of it, or you're doing something or living in such a way that others see as glamorous or noteworthy. There's a whole list of expectations that come along with that. And because most of us, when we have that reaction, or when we have that sort of longing, when we see something where people are doing a thing that maybe we've dreamed about or that we've done and had a particular experience, we automatically laminate on our feelings, our hopes, our, everything onto these experiences to shape them into something that makes sense to us rather than maybe the experience that's actually happening. And I think the other thing we do is there's this assumption that if you're doing something that looks amazing, adventurous, exciting, glamorous, sparkly on the outside, that the actual experience must live up to that image. And I definitely experienced both of those things while I was traveling. I definitely had periods where I felt down. I had some FOMO for what was happening, quote, back home. I made connections with people and then had to, detach from that and go to another place. So I had off days where I just wanted to stay in bed and read a book or sleep or cry. I had some level of, guilt or self-flagellation about how could you possibly feel sad or blue? You're in this amazing place and people are, envious of your ability to do this. You almost don't deserve to have an off day. And that's ridiculous. Of course you do. It's life. We're human beings. So I definitely experienced that. And then the other side of that, sometimes all I wanted to do was sit in a hammock and read a book, not because I was sad, but because that's what felt good and nourishing to me. And in the back of my mind is that critter brain that says, oh, but you're in this location that has these 20 things that are on everybody's bucket list, and everybody wants to get the Instagram picture at this waterfall and at this attraction and doing this activity and eating this food in this restaurant. And so there's this external pressure or expectation that when you are in a place that you have to do all of the things that are the desirable list worthy things, or you've squandered your time. You're wasting your time. And that also is a completely unrealistic expectation to put on yourself when you're doing anything. I don't care what it is. The way that you host a dinner party, the way that you travel, the way that you embark on a creative endeavor, learning how to paint, deciding to do a marathon. How you do those things, how you prepare for them, what you actually do during those activities, what you get out of it, what you put into it is hugely personal. And the only expectations that you may even want to look at meeting are your own. And even those you have to question because largely, if you're not paying attention, those expectations are often built on what you think you should be doing. Anything that is a should is not your agenda, it's somebody else's. Anytime you say should, you are parroting what someone else told you or modeled for you as what needs to happen. The word should be a red flag for you. So for me, having an off day or deciding to do nothing became a little self-care ritual for me. Because when I was doing those things, it came from me. And I was able to do those things and learn to not feel less than and learn to not feel guilty about those. Doing nothing is still something. We talked before about rest and integration. And sometimes rest and integration means doing nothing, just breathing, just letting your thoughts cycle through the wash in your mind. Sometimes doing nothing is sitting in a chair trying to pick out the bird song of various species of birds. It doesn't have a dollar sign attached to it. It doesn't have a to-do list attached to it. And those things, that nothing, is just as important to do as anything else on your bucket list. And if there are things that we want to do, then I think the mindset has to be it's not necessary to do all of them right now. It's this idea that eat until you're full, not until you clean your plate. There's a huge difference. You can't preload experiences as if it's a bank that you can draw off of later. You don't have to cram it all in. You shouldn't, because what you're doing is you're creating or spreading a mediocre or less than mediocre experience across a ton of things, spreading yourself thin, as opposed to prioritizing those things that are the most meaningful or the most pleasurable for you and really, really experiencing them, really having a depth of that experience where you really fully enjoy it. You're fully present, not thinking about, oh my gosh, how am I going to get to this next one? And should I just, spend 5 seconds here because I got to get to this other one? And if it falls off the list, then apparently the whole itinerary is bad. And I think we all do tend to fall into that. And so even in places where there was a huge list of things that I could have done, I had to resist the critter brain telling me that I'll never have this opportunity again. I'll never get to be at this restaurant having this amazing food. I'll never get to be in this country seeing all of the sights and sounds that everyone says that I should see and that I want to see. But I purposely made myself slow down and really prioritize the things that I wanted to do so that I could fully experience them rather than not really being there for those things that I had said were important to me because I was so focused on the next thing and the next thing that I really deprived myself of the experience I was trying to have. So, something to think about when you look at this buffet of life. While you're traveling, that's an easy one to connect this concept with, but it's really true of everything that we do in our lives. When we try to put in all the things that either we're interested in or conditioned to believe that we have to be interested in, when we try to put all of those on the list as things that we should be enjoying or experiencing, we end up enjoying or experiencing none of them because we're not present with it. We can't possibly be. We're cramming stuff into an already full bag. So that has been a really big lesson for me as I come back to slow down, really pay attention and prioritize those things, those activities, those people that I want to interact with, that I want to experience, and truly do those things. And if that means other things fall off and I don't have time for them, that's okay. And it's only when we can curate our experience like that we really actually are satiated. I think when we are continually feeling this pressure to get 1,100 things done, even if they're things that we think we want to do, we create more hunger as opposed to anything else because we're in that constant state of pursuit. Whereas if we pause and really allow ourselves to be present in the thing we're doing right now that we've chosen to do and try to shut out the long list of things that we want to do, that's when we truly experience being nourished, fed, satiated by that thing. And that's when we really feel the comfort and satisfaction of that. And then we don't have the same kind of crazed, harried, pursuit of the want because we're fully present experiencing what we have right here, right now. And then magically, all of those phantom needs, those phantom wants, they tend to melt away, leaving us with what is actually truly important to us. And then we stop feeling so like we're missing out. We stop feeling so deprived or hungry for the next thing because we've really taken the time to chew, savor, swallow what's right in front of us. But I really think one of my biggest takeaways from all of this travel that I've just wrapped up is another thing that I can connect to how I live my life and my own journey of authenticity is that even the things that you forget are still working inside you. Just because you didn't document it or share doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think for me, this was such a freeing and calming thought. How many times do you have a coach for 6 months, or you take a class, or you go learn how to do some, basic Krav Maga, you know, tactics, or you try to learn another language maybe, and you just have this compulsion that you have to write down all these notes and you got to retain all of this information for instant recall, or it doesn't count, or it didn't work. And what you really find is your subconscious doesn't forget. This is exactly the reason why we have to spend so much time continuing to peel back all of these stories, continue to peel back episodes of trauma or pivotal events in our lives that, while on the surface we may have forgotten, but they continue to shape how we show up in the world. Just because we forgot about it on an active level does not mean that it's not still working inside us. And so, just as that is true for negative things like trauma or conditioning, it's also true for the positive things that we're doing in our life. Just because I can't remember the exact words or 6 steps that my life coach told me 3 years ago, I will find that at some point I can look back and say, oh, I was doing that automatically and I had forgotten I even learned that. And so I'm having a lot of that experience now. In fact, I have been taking, there's an audio Spanish course that I've been taking, and this man's particular method is 100% based on that. He even says in the beginning of his intro to his course that he doesn't want you to take notes. He expects that you will forget a lot of it, and he actually encourages that because that's just part of his teaching style. And it's been a really effective class for me. Number one, he disarmed the anxiety of needing to remember everything, needing to be good at everything. He took that off the table right at the beginning. And then as I went through the class, I found I did forget a lot of stuff, but then randomly he would go through a drill and I would just pull this stuff out of nowhere and forget that I knew it. And I think this is important to remember as we learn new things about ourselves. We get a new skill, we have a new insight into our truth. And there's this compulsion that says we have to be able to, have instant recall of that and be able to perfectly describe what we learned about ourselves. And we have to remember all of these things. But that's impossible for us to keep all that in active memory. Again, this is why we put so many things on autopilot, is because we cannot possibly, we do not have the capacity to process in active, noticeable, recognizable ways everything, every input that comes into us on a daily or even hourly basis. The fact that something went on autopilot and is working in your life in a positive way, that's a win. And so I'm trying to remember that as I come back into this version of my world, that all of the things that I learned or experienced that have helped me on my path while I was traveling, I can have anxiety about maybe not remembering them all and maybe not writing them all down and maybe not making a Facebook post about them all. But I know I have confidence that those things are still working inside me, even without me knowing it. It's that idea that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And even though we may not be able to recall it, our subconscious, our third eye, whatever you want to call it, doesn't forget. And so the important thing is, let's make sure that what we are feeding our subconscious, that it's going to remember later, even if we forget, is nourishing, is healthy. So instead of feeding ourselves additional trauma or inauthenticity, instead of feeding ourselves those things, if we feed ourselves the healthy things, the true insights into who we really are, the skills that help us navigate a world that is often crazy and nonsensical, having people around us that have the kind of energy and view of the world that is nourishing and supporting to us. If we're doing all of those things and taking those things in, even if we actively forget about the impact or the lesson from those things, it's still working inside of us. And so that for me is what is going to comfort me through this idea that, which could feel overwhelming, that I did learn all of this and I did have all of this growth, but oh my gosh, what if I can't remember it all from my made for lifetime movie? Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm sure that over the course of the next several days, weeks, months, I will continue to have things pop up for me that really came out of my time away. And the important thing is, change doesn't happen on a schedule. Doesn't happen on my schedule, doesn't happen on your schedule. It doesn't even happen on the schedule of the people that try to tell you what you should think the schedule should be. Change is something that, as you are vulnerable and expose yourself to new ways of thinking and new ways of being, it can take time to filter through all of those layers that we have, our own layers, our community's layers, our ancestors' layers. It takes time to filter through. And in that filtering process, there are things that we forget that continue to work within us. There are things that we forget that become irrelevant and go away, and we don't even know it. And there are things that we do remember that we think are really important until we try to actually live them. And we find it's not the comfortable fit that we thought it was at a moment in time. And that's okay too. And there's definitely the things that, as they pop up, whether because we've actively remembered them or we're reminded somewhere down the road, those things that truly become a part of how we show up in the world, those are the gifts. And we can't predict when they're going to come back to us. The only thing that we can do is continue to stretch ourselves, be open to questions, be open to new possibilities and experiences, to allow ourselves to have vulnerable connections with other people, with ourselves, with the world, so that we have a greater chance of those things leading us to that next level of our own truth and our own authenticity. And that's how all this works. And you don't have to go on some epic 4-month journey to do that at all. I mean, it's great if you can, but there's every opportunity to be open to all of these inputs in our day to day lives, commuting to work, to your job, going to your kids' soccer games on the weekends, singing karaoke with your pals at happy hour, whatever it is that you're doing. There's that opportunity to learn these new things about yourself, learn these new things about how you want to show up in the world, and then forget about them. And that change is going to happen on its own schedule. And more often than not, you'll be delighted when you notice that pop up again. Hey, thanks for listening to A Brave Journey. I'm so happy you were here. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and leave a review, and share this with a friend who could benefit too. See you next time.